There are mornings that feel so ordinary they leave no memory at all. December 24, 2002. Modesto, California. A quiet suburban street in the hours before Christmas. Frost on the windshields. Wreaths on the front doors. A neighborhood doing what neighborhoods do on that particular morning. Sleeping, wrapping gifts, putting coffee on. On Covina Avenue, inside a tan-colored house with a flower bed out front and a nursery freshly painted inside, a woman named Laci Peterson was watching the morning news. Her husband, Scott, kissed her goodbye. He said she seemed fine. He said she was comfortable. He said he was going fishing. He drove 90 miles alone to the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay. He launched a 14-foot aluminum boat that most of his friends had never seen. He fished, alone, without a witness who could account for him clearly, without catching anything. He drove home. The dog was in the backyard. The leash was still attached. Laci was gone. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, had called the house at 8:17 that morning to say she'd be running late to Christmas Eve dinner. No one answered. She called again. And again. By early afternoon she was standing on the doorstep, knocking. The Christmas presents were still under the tree. The kettle had been on. The phone charger was still plugged into the wall. 8 months pregnant, 2 weeks from her due date, with a name already chosen for her son, Laci Peterson had simply vanished into a Christmas morning that kept moving without her. What investigators would spend the next 4 months trying to understand was not only where Laci had gone, it was who Scott Peterson actually was. Because the man standing in that driveway, the man fielding worried calls from her family, the man who told police he had an okay marriage, that man had spent the previous 6 weeks building a second life. And the most unsettling thing about Scott Peterson was never that he seemed dangerous. It was that he never stopped smiling. Welcome to Beneath Static Minds. Today we go beneath the surface of one of the most psychologically disturbing cases in modern American crime, the disappearance and murder of Laci Peterson, and the cold, constructed double life her husband had been quietly running while she slept beside him. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from. We have a global community here and we want to hear from you. Now, let us get into it. If you had asked anyone who knew the Petersons to describe Scott in the fall of 2002, you would have received a portrait so consistent it was almost suspicious in its uniformity. Handsome, charming, easygoing. A fertilizer salesman with a broad smile and an easy manner. The kind of man who remembered your name at a party, who could talk about anything, who made you feel like you had his full attention. Well-dressed without being flashy. Likeable without effort. Financially stable. And Laci Peterson, born Laci Rocha, was the kind of woman people simply gravitated toward. Warm and vivacious, trained as a chef, deeply invested in the life she was building. She had decorated their home with care. She had a garden. She had close friends who loved her genuinely, not out of social obligation but out of real affection for who she was. By every external measurement, the Petersons were the couple other couples quietly aspired to be. Scott had met Laci years before they married in 1997. By the summer of 2002, when Laci announced her pregnancy, when she was calling her mother to share the news, buying baby books, painting the nursery ocean blue, choosing the name Connor for the son she was expecting, everything from the outside looked exactly as it should. But something inside Scott Peterson's interior life had already moved in a direction no one around him knew about. On November 20, 2002, 6 weeks before Laci disappeared, Scott Peterson walked into the Elephant Bar restaurant in Fresno to meet a woman named Amber Fry. She was a 27-year-old massage therapist and single mother, introduced to him by a mutual friend. He was 30 years old. He was not wearing a wedding ring. He told Amber Fry that he was not married. He told a mutual friend, separately, that he had recently lost his wife. He said those words, that he had recently lost his wife, while Laci Peterson was alive. While she was 7 months pregnant with his child. While she was at home, probably in the kitchen, doing something ordinary and unremarkable. He had already, in some precise psychological sense, buried her. He had constructed the grief before the death. Scott Peterson and Amber Fry began a relationship. He was attentive and warm. He sent her flowers. He called her regularly. On one occasion he told her he was in Paris. He was in Modesto. He was lying on the phone to his girlfriend while his pregnant wife was a room away, asleep. The investigators and psychologists who would later examine Scott Peterson's behavior describe what he was doing not simply as infidelity, but as the construction of an entirely parallel reality. A second narrative he was living simultaneously, with creative investment and attention to detail that went far beyond what desire alone would require. This is the question that the case has never fully resolved. Was the affair the reason he killed Laci? Or was the affair just where the visible edge of something darker happened to surface? In forensic behavioral science there is a concept sometimes called pre-incident anomaly, small, easily overlooked behaviors that, examined in retrospect, suggest a person was already moving towards something they had not yet acted on. In Scott Peterson's case, those anomalies began accumulating in early December 2002, and they were specific enough to be disturbing. He purchased a boat. A used 14-foot aluminum fishing vessel, bought with cash, registered quietly, kept without mention to friends or family. Laci's close friends would later say they had no idea the boat existed. There was no fishing equipment in the garage that predated the purchase. No fishing license on record. No friends who recalled him expressing any interest in recreational fishing before that point. He paid cash, registered the boat, and said nothing. He then applied for a guest membership at the Berkeley Marina, a public boat launch on San Francisco Bay, 90 miles from Modesto. He visited the marina at least once before Christmas Eve to test the boat on the water. Prosecutors would later present evidence showing he had searched the internet in early December for information on bay currents, ocean tides, and the distance from the marina to open water. He also searched for information on the effects of salt water on human remains. That search, conducted by a man whose pregnant wife would later be found washed ashore in that same body of water, does not prove murder by itself. But it asks a question so loud it cannot be unasked. There was also the matter of a life insurance policy. In the weeks before Christmas, Scott Peterson made calls inquiring about the value of Laci's existing policy. Not to increase coverage. Not to add a beneficiary. Simply to check what it was worth. And Amber Fry would later testify that in those same weeks, Scott had told her that the upcoming holidays would be the last of his old life. That he was going to be spending Christmas alone for the first time. That everything was about to change. He said this before Laci went missing. He said it while she was alive and preparing Christmas dinner and exchanging gifts with her family. He was narrating the end of his marriage to his girlfriend while his wife was still inside it. The people who knew the Petersons, friends, neighbors, co-workers, would later sit in interview chairs and try to locate the first moment something felt wrong. Almost all of them landed on the same admission. There had been something. A flatness behind his eyes when someone mentioned the baby. A pause before he smiled that was slightly too long. A way of talking about the pregnancy that sounded constructed rather than felt. But no one said anything because there was nothing specific enough to say. Because the most effective hidden darkness is never the kind that announces itself. It is the kind that wishes you a good morning in the hallway and keeps walking. December 24, 2002. Scott Peterson told police he left the house somewhere around 9:30 in the morning. Laci was watching the morning news. She seemed well. She had mentioned taking the dog for a walk in East La Loma Park, their usual route, a walk she had done many times before. He said he kissed her goodbye. He drove to the Berkeley Marina. He launched the boat. He fished alone until mid-afternoon. He drove home. The dog was in the backyard with its leash still on, as though Laci had simply dissolved mid-walk, somewhere between the house and wherever she was going. He called Sharon Rocha. He called Laci's brother, Brent. He called 911. When police arrived, Scott Peterson's behavior struck several officers in a way they found difficult to name precisely but impossible to dismiss. He was not hysterical. He was cooperative. He answered questions and offered details. But he did not behave like a man who believed his pregnant wife had been taken. He asked very few questions about the search. The questions he did ask seemed oriented toward understanding the structure of the investigation rather than its urgency. Investigators who later reviewed the interviews noted a specific quality to his responses. Measured, appropriately emotional at the right intervals, carefully shaped. Not the raw, disorganized communication of someone in shock. Something closer to a performance being managed in real time. Within days, Scott was doing national media interviews. He appeared on television composed and controlled, speaking about Laci and his marriage in complete, considered sentences. The emotional markers appeared at the expected moments. He framed his grief correctly. He said the right things. He never cried on camera. Not once. And while community volunteers flooded Modesto, while flyers were printed and search grids were organized and people drove in from neighboring counties to help, Scott Peterson did not join the searches. He said he was more useful making calls and following leads. He stayed inside. 6 days after Laci disappeared, on December 30, 2002, Amber Fry called Modesto police and disclosed the affair. She had seen the story on the news. She had recognized the truck, the occupation, the name. She understood, with cold clarity, that she had been used as a prop in a story she hadn't been told she was part of. She agreed to keep talking to Scott while wearing a wire. Over the weeks that followed, while Sharon Rocha held press conferences with tears running down her face, while Laci's friends distributed missing person flyers on street corners, investigators recorded more than 29 hours of phone calls between Scott Peterson and Amber Frey. In those calls he told her he missed her. He was warm and attentive. On New Year's Eve 2002, as a candlelight vigil was being held for his missing wife in Modesto, Scott Peterson called Amber Frey and told her he was in Paris. He was in Modesto. He drove past the vigil to get to where he was making the call. Whether the irony of that registered to him, whether any part of him paused at the sight of candles burning for Laci while he reached for his phone, is something no recording ever captured. But nothing in his behavior suggested it did. When investigators began pulling the threads of Scott Peterson's account, what they found was not a single lie. It was a system of lies, each one supporting the next, each one serving a precise function in the architecture of a man performing innocence. His alibi was essentially unverifiable. The Berkeley Marina parking receipt placed his truck there. It did not confirm when he arrived, when he launched the boat, how long he was on the water, or when he left. He had a window of several hours on Christmas Eve that was, for practical purposes, his alone. His claim to have been fishing for sturgeon drew immediate scrutiny. Sturgeon fishing requires specific equipment and rigging. Investigators found no evidence in the boat or among his gear consistent with that type of fishing. He had launched a nearly empty boat onto a cold bay, on Christmas Eve, and come back with nothing, and the absence of any verifiable detail about that trip grew more conspicuous the longer investigators examined it. His internet search history told a different story than his words. Beyond the searches for bay currents and tidal patterns, prosecutors presented evidence that Scott had searched for information on boat ramps in the Berkeley Marina area, waterways in San Francisco Bay, and the behavior of decomposing remains in saltwater. These searches had been conducted in December, in the days after he met Amber Frey and in the weeks before Christmas. When investigators searched the Peterson home and the warehouse Scott rented for his fertilizer business, a warehouse Laci had apparently never visited, they found traces consistent with concrete in the warehouse and in the bed of Scott's truck. The significance would not fully emerge until April. In his wallet, among the items he carried daily, investigators found a photograph. Not of Laci. Not of their wedding. Not of the nursery he had helped prepare for their son. A photograph of Amber Frey. Phone records showed that Scott had called Amber dozens of times in the weeks before Christmas. On December 23rd, the night before Laci disappeared, he called her. On December 24th itself, after reporting his wife missing, he called her again. The recorded calls from January and February of 2003 revealed a man who was not deteriorating under pressure, not cracking, not struggling. He spoke to Amber in the voice of someone with a future clearly in view. He talked about restaurants he wanted to try. He talked about travel. He laughed. He was curious about her life. He sounded, in the words of investigators who listened to those recordings, completely fine. Amber Frey's recorded cooperation with police gave the prosecution its most human evidence. Not forensic, not circumstantial, but the sound of a man's actual voice, the texture of his actual thinking, in the weeks when his wife's body was drifting in a bay 90 miles from his home. To understand Scott Peterson, you have to resist the simplest version of the story. The simplest version is that he was a monster wearing a human face. That the charm was always a mask, the marriage always a performance, the normal life always a lie. That version is clean and satisfying and lets everyone else off the hook, because monsters are different from the rest of us and difference is comforting. The more disturbing version is that Scott Peterson was not so different from people we all know. Forensic psychologists who have examined the case describe a man with a particular constellation of traits, none of which, taken individually, would raise serious alarm. The instinctive management of other people's perceptions. The adaptability. The ability to present exactly what a given situation seemed to require. The absence of what clinicians sometimes call object permanence in emotional relationships. The way people became less real to him once they were no longer in front of him. He did not appear to process Laci's existence in the way most people process someone they love. At some point in their marriage, no one can say precisely when, she had transitioned from a person he was present with to a problem he was managing. The shift was not loud. There were no reported episodes of cruelty, no domestic incidents on record, no blowout arguments that friends could point to later. It happened quietly. The way a door closes in a house where no one notices the draft. What made the recorded phone calls to Amber Frey so psychologically disturbing to investigators was not their content alone. It was their quality. Scott Peterson did not sound like a man living through the most scrutinized, publicly devastating experience of his life. He did not sound fractured or dissociated or barely holding things together. He sounded present, engaged, emotionally available to someone while remaining emotionally absent from everything else. This kind of compartmentalization, the ability to maintain two entirely separate emotional realities with no apparent interference between them, is something researchers associate with a specific profile. Not theatrical villainy. Not the explosive, volatile behavior that crime stories tend to favor. Something quieter. A person who reorganizes around new circumstances the way water fills a container. Adaptive. Unbothered. Oriented entirely toward their own survival and continuation. Scott Peterson hired defense attorney Mark Garagos, who mounted a vigorous defense built around the possibility of an alternative suspect. A transient, a cult, someone else, anyone. Scott appeared to receive this strategy not with the desperate gratitude of an innocent man but with the patient confidence of someone who believed his version of events could hold. Even as the investigation tightened. Even as wiretaps accumulated. Even as the media camped permanently outside the house on Covina Avenue. He kept calling Amber. He kept performing love. He kept the second reality running as a parallel process alongside the first. And that capacity, for sustained, undisturbed performance under conditions of extraordinary pressure, is the thing that investigators and psychologists return to again and again when they try to describe what made this case so uniquely unsettling. It was not the violence. Violence, as terrible as it is, has a kind of comprehensible darkness to it. It was the calmness. April 13, 2003. A man walking his dog near Point Isabel on the Richmond shoreline, not far from where Scott Peterson had launched his boat on Christmas Eve, discovered human remains in the shallow water and rocks at low tide. Small. Badly decomposed. A male fetus. The umbilical cord was still attached. The following day, approximately 1 mile away on the same shoreline, a woman's torso washed ashore. Headless. Without hands or feet. Investigators would later determine that the body had been weighted. The concrete consistent with what had been found in trace amounts in Scott Peterson's warehouse and his truck bed. DNA testing confirmed what Sharon Rocha already knew from the moment she heard the news. The remains were Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. Scott Peterson was notified on April 18. He was arrested the same day near San Diego, approximately 3 miles from the Mexican border. He had bleached his hair and dyed it. He was carrying more than $15,000 in cash. He had his brother's ID. He had multiple cell phones, camping equipment, and sleeping pills. He told police he was going to play golf. He said he was heading to his parents' house. He said he was not running. The arrest produced something more gradual than a rupture. It was the collapse of a structure that had been hollow for a long time, the final moment when the weight exceeded what the performance could hold. People who had believed in his innocence and many had found themselves confronting not one piece of evidence but the full accumulation of everything. The affair, the boat, the bay, the concrete, the internet searches, the cash, the bleached hair, the photograph of Amber in his wallet, the recorded calls on New Year's Eve, the life insurance inquiry, the absence of grief that looked like grief. Each piece taken alone could be questioned. Taken together, they described a man who had been designing his exit from a marriage for months. The trial lasted 5 months. Mark Garagos argued strenuously that Scott had been convicted in the court of public opinion before a single piece of evidence was tested in a courtroom. He pointed to alternative theories, alternative suspects, reasonable doubt. Scott Peterson sat through the testimony of Sharon Rocha, through the descriptions of Laci's decomposed remains, through the accounts of her friends and family, with an expression that almost never fully broke open. He wept on occasion. But those who watched him closely, including several jurors who would later speak publicly, described the weeping as something that happened at the right moments rather than something that arrived without warning, the way real grief does. On November 12, 2004, the jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. First-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson. Second-degree murder in the death of Connor Peterson. He was sentenced to death in March 2005. He showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence. The court ruled unanimously that the trial judge had made a series of clear and significant errors during jury selection. Specifically that numerous prospective jurors had been improperly dismissed for expressing personal opposition to the death penalty, even though those same jurors had indicated they would be willing to follow the law and impose it if required. The court upheld his murder convictions entirely. The guilt, in the court's judgment, was not in question. Only the penalty had been improperly decided. In December 2021, Scott Peterson was re-sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was moved off death row at San Quentin and transferred to Mule Creek State Prison in Amador County, where he remains today. A judge denied his request for a new trial in 2022, ruling against allegations of juror misconduct. But the legal story did not end there. In January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project, a nonprofit organization that investigates claims of wrongful conviction, announced it was taking Scott Peterson's case. The organization stated it was investigating his claim of actual innocence, and filed motions seeking DNA testing of evidence and access to materials from the original investigation. A judge denied testing for 13 items the defense requested. Access to evidence was partially granted. Out of 600 pieces of evidence requested, approximately 36 were made available. In August 2025, the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed a full habeas corpus petition, alleging that Scott Peterson had been wrongfully convicted on the basis of what they described as false scientific evidence. The petition argued that the forensic science used at trial, including testimony used to establish a date of death for the unborn Connor, was unreliable and would not meet current scientific standards. The filing stated that the jury had relied on evidence that has since been undermined, and that critical materials were destroyed or withheld before trial. In April 2026, a San Mateo County Superior Court judge denied the petition, ruling that the claims were either procedurally barred or lacked merit. The Los Angeles Innocence Project immediately announced its intention to appeal to a higher court. Prosecutors and investigators involved in the original case have stood consistently behind the 2004 conviction. Scott Peterson, now 53 years old and incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison, continues to maintain that he did not kill his wife and son. He has said this for more than 20 years. With the same composed delivery. The same performance of wronged innocence. The same expression that never quite breaks open. And somewhere in that consistency, in the decades-long continuity of that composed, unbothered face, is the thing that has always made this case so psychologically suffocating to those who have followed it closely. Because innocent people who have been wrongly imprisoned often carry a particular kind of desperation. A rawness. A grief that keeps returning to the surface whether they want it to or not. Scott Peterson has never looked desperate. He has looked managed. Sharon Rocha wrote a book called For Laci. In it, she describes the specific experience of watching a private grief become a permanent public spectacle. The cameras outside the house. The strangers who discuss her daughter as though she were a character rather than a person. The permanent attachment of Laci's name to the name of the man who killed her. She writes about watching Scott Peterson on national television in the early weeks of the investigation, when he was still presenting himself publicly as a grieving husband. He spoke about Laci in the past tense. Before her body was found. He waved it off as a slip. An emotional slip. Anyone can misspeak under stress. But the past tense was already there. Quietly. Ahead of schedule. Laci Peterson's case did something concrete and irreversible beyond the trial itself. In April 2004, Congress passed and the President signed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, known informally as Laci and Connor's Law. It established that harm to a fetus during the commission of a federal crime constitutes a separate criminal offense. It recognized in law what Sharon Rocha had always known as a mother. That Connor Peterson was a person. That he had a name already chosen. That he deserved to be counted. But Laci's mother is still alive. She still lives with the weight of what happened in a way that no legislation, no verdict, no sentence, and no appeal has ever fully addressed. And if you read her actual words, not the court documents, not the crime reports, but her words about her daughter, you find something the forensic record cannot hold. Laci Peterson was not a case. She was somebody's daughter. Somebody's friend. A woman who planted flowers and cooked with skill and laughed loudly and was, by every honest account of everyone who knew her, genuinely and uncomplicatedly good. She had bought a mobile for above her son's crib. Ducks and stars. She had already imagined his face. There is a nursery in the story of this case that no documentary, no trial exhibit, no legal brief ever quite addresses directly. A room that was prepared with love and care. A crib that was assembled. A mobile that was hung above it. A room that was ready. And stayed that way. That room, more than the bay, more than the boat, more than the recordings of Scott Peterson laughing on the phone, is the emotional center of this story. The space between what was built and what was taken. The gap between the life Laci Peterson was preparing for and the morning that ended it. Scott Peterson can appeal. He can file motions. He can sit across from cameras in prison and deliver 20 more years of composed denials. The Los Angeles Innocence Project can argue before every court available to them. But the mobile still turns. And the crib is still empty. And the question that this case leaves in everyone who has ever looked at it honestly, not the legal question, not the forensic question, but the human one, is the same question it has always been. How do you build a nursery for a child you have already decided will never come home? How do you paint the walls and choose the name and hang the mobile, and then do what Scott Peterson is convicted of doing? There is no clean psychological answer to that. There is no profile, no clinical category, no theoretical framework that makes it comprehensible. There is only the fact of it. The cold, quiet, ordinary fact. And the face of a man who smiled all the way through it. A man who, by every public account, is still smiling now. 30 miles from the bay where Laci Peterson's body came to rest, inside a state prison in Amador County, Scott Peterson wakes up every morning. He eats. He files legal documents. He gives interviews. He maintains his story. The bay does not remember him. But Sharon Rocha does. And somewhere, in a house that no longer exists in the same way it once did, a mobile with ducks and stars was waiting for a child who never arrived. That is what Scott Peterson took. Not just a life. Not just 2 lives. The waiting. The readiness. The specific, tender, irreplaceable shape of something that was about to begin. That is what the courtroom could not fully measure, what the sentencing could not fully address, what the legal system, for all its procedures and motions and appeals, has never quite been able to name. Laci and Peterson. May 4, 1975. December 24, 2002. Connor Lee Peterson. Never born. This has been Beneath Static Minds.